We continue our way through the Acts of the Apostles. We turn to Acts, the 17th chapter, and the story of Paul in Athens. I encourage you to find that in the Pew Bible provided, or the Bible that you brought from home. Acts, the 17th chapter. We'll read verses 22 through 31. If you back up just a little bit in verses 16 through 21, it's the beginning of the story of Paul there. Paul has looked around the city. He has seen what is there, and they know he is there, and they know of his reputation and are interested in hearing what he has to say. And so we pick things up with Paul speaking in verse 22. Then Paul stood in front of the Areopagus and said, "Athenians, I see how extremely religious you are in every way. For as I went through the city and looked carefully at the objects of your worship, I found among them an altar with the inscription, 'To an unknown God.' What therefore you worship is unknown, this I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it, he who is Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in shrines made by human hands, nor is he served by human hands, as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mortals life and breath and all things. From one ancestor he made all nations to inhabit the whole earth, and he allotted the times of their existence and the boundaries of the places where they would live, so they would search for God and perhaps grope for him and find him, though he indeed is not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being. As even some of your own poets have said, for we too are his offspring. Since we are God's offspring, we ought not to think that the deity is like gold or silver or stone or an image formed by the art and imagination of mortals. While God has overlooked the times of human ignorance, now he commands all people everywhere to repent, because he has fixed a day on which he will have the world judged in righteousness by a man whom he has appointed, and of this he has given assurance to all by raising him from the dead." Here ends our reading of God's holy word. The grass withers and the flower fades, but the word of our God stands forever. I enjoy most all things British, particularly British comedy. I just think things are funnier with an English accent. And I love the British comedy troupe Monty Python. Very strange group of lads, those guys are. One of my favorite skits is called Argument Clinic, and I want to tell you a bit about that. The premise is that a guy pays to have an argument. And when he shows up, the chap he's arguing with does little more than contradict him. "No, you didn't." "Yes, I did." "No, you didn't." "Yes, I did." And it goes back and forth until the guy rings a bell. Ding! Time's up. Good morning. And he doesn't argue anymore. And he says, if you want to argue, you're going to have to pay for 5 more minutes. So the client reluctantly shells out a little bit more money and tries to start arguing again. And the argument this time is whether or not he paid for more arguing. And the professional arguer keeps doing the contradiction thing again. "No, you didn't." "Yes, I did." "No, you didn't." And then the guy who paid for the argument realizes he's won the argument when he says, "If I didn't pay you, why are you still arguing with me?" And the professional arguer says, "I could be arguing in my spare time." How about you? Do you fancy a good argument? Have you ever had an argument about politics or religion? And how did that argument about religion work for you? Did you talk somebody into believing in Jesus Christ? Or did the argument not end so well? I remember hearing another comedian talking about playing the board game Monopoly with his family over the holidays, and he asked the audience, have any of you ever played Monopoly and not had it end in an argument? Well, the way many of our arguments about religion end, they don't end well. I say all this about arguments because our text for today is an argument of sorts with Paul and the good people of Athens. During this Easter season, we're working our way through the Acts of the Apostles, the story of the early church, and the text for today is from the 17th chapter of Acts and an argument of sorts featuring Paul. He's in Athens. It's the city that enjoys a good argument, the home of Plato, the home of public discourse, the original university town, if you will. They like a good argument in Athens, and in Paul, they have found somebody who is himself rather argumentative. Now, most of us are not like Paul. We don't enjoy a good argument. That may not be our personality type, and that's fine, but the story of Paul in Athens is still worth a good look. Not just for pointers on how to win a debate, but more importantly, for how we can talk about our faith. The story of Paul in Athens is a template for how to talk about our faith, because whatever our personality type may be, we are all called to be evangelists. We are all called to walk the walk and talk the talk. So the first thing we see in this template for how to talk about our faith is that conversation doesn't have to be an argument. You'll notice the very first thing Paul does is compliment them. Actually, before that, Paul does a little advance work. He looks around the city. He goes into this conversation with his eyes open. Verses 16 through 22 sets the stage, and then in that 22nd verse, Paul begins to speak and says, Athenians, I see how extremely religious you are in every way. First, I went through your city and looked carefully at the objects of your worship. I found among them an altar with the inscription, to an unknown God. What you therefore worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you. So Paul, despite his well-deserved reputation for being argumentative, and despite the fact that verse 16 tells us he was deeply distressed to see that the city was full of idols, Paul does not launch into a finger-pointing attack on their idolatry. He instead identifies with their religious curiosity, and he offers them a compliment. I borrowed the sermon title today from a Bob Dylan song, You Gotta Serve Somebody. He wrote it when he was searching himself and trying to come to terms with his own understanding of who God is. I think Paul before him and Bob Dylan are both on to something. We do have to serve somebody. We do have to believe in something. We have an innate curiosity. We desire peace and purpose, a sense of meaning. Amen. So Paul identifies with their religious curiosity. And then he finds common ground with them after paying a compliment. He talks about God as a creator. He suggests that the God who created everything, the God in whom we live and move and have our being, does not live in shrines made by human hands. That God is too big to capture in gold or silver or stone. That God cannot be kept behind a velvet rope. In making this argument, Paul is both agreeing with them about God as a creator, and he is daring to disagree with them to say that the creator cannot be represented by something that is created with human hands. And then in Paul's closing argument at the end of our text, talks about an assurance that we are given in the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Paul begins the conversation talking about religious curiosity. He talks about creation, but then he ends up talking about who he understands Jesus to be. He talks about the resurrection. Because if we're going to talk about our faith, we talk about the resurrection. It is the pole that holds up the tent, if you will. Now, Luke, who wrote Acts, lets us know in verse 32 that when he spoke of the resurrection of the dead, some scoffed, but others said, "We'll hear you again about this." And at that point, Paul left them, but some of them joined him and became believers. Well, here's where it ties back into arguments. When we talk about our faith in Jesus Christ as an Easter people, when we talk about the resurrection of the dead, some will scoff. Some will dismiss talk of resurrection, of an afterlife. Some will dismiss religion as primitive and point to the church's rather sketchy history and heaping doses of hypocrisy we have offered up over the years. Not everybody's going to believe. Now, whatever you may think about the history of this nation and the role that Christian faith has played in its development, even if you think the United States of America was founded as a Christian nation, and I'll be happy to argue with you about that later on if you wish, even if the Bible Belt goes really well with your wardrobe, make no mistake about it, we live in a secular world. I told the class today, and I've mentioned it to you before, do you know what the second largest religious group in our country is today? The first are Roman Catholics, primarily because of the recent influx of Hispanic immigrants. The second largest religious group in the United States of America today are nuns. And I don't mean Roman Catholic nuns, I mean N-O-N-E, people who have no religious preference or identification. The second largest religious group in our country are people who have no identifiable religion. We live in a secular world, and it's becoming more secular each day. I mean, it seems to me atheists have become almost evangelical in sharing their atheism and their agnostic views. We need to be able to talk about our faith. Times have changed. But the world's need and hunger for the good news of the gospel remains. It's imperative we know how to talk about our faith, because scoffers and cynics and seekers need to hear the good news. So when we talk about how to talk about our faith, we need some pointers. We don't need to be argumentative. We're much more likely to walk somebody into the faith than we are to talk them into it. We also, like Paul, want to find common ground with people of other faiths and with unchurched people, people who care about their community just as much as we church folks do. But like Paul, we cannot stop there with that common ground. Talk about faith, to be genuine, moves from the general to the particular. To talk about our faith is to talk about Jesus Christ. To talk about who we understand him to be and the difference that he has made in our lives. We believe in him. We follow him. It is his life and his love that have changed the world and changed us. So our faith as an Easter people is not some watered down basic civic religion. Our faith is not some idyllic notion like a Coke commercial of old where we can all sit on a hill and hold hands and sing songs and share a Coke, and wouldn't it be nice if we all just got along? No, our faith is rooted in the person and work of Jesus Christ. And so like Paul, we need to be able to say, this is who I know God to be, Jesus of Nazareth, who lived and died and who lives again. Now, I know most of us are rather reluctant to talk about our faith, to talk about Jesus and the difference that he has made in our lives. We may even use phrases like, now, I don't want to preach at you. Now, as a preacher, I take no offense at that use of the term. I don't want to preach at anybody either. I'd rather preach to somebody. Or better yet, I'd rather talk to and talk with somebody. And I can tell you one of the reasons that I'm Presbyterian is because we respect people of other faiths. We respect other viewpoints. Like a good Brit, we fancy a healthy debate. We really prefer dialogue. So with that in mind, I'd like to share an analogy with you about how we can talk about our faith. And I have mentioned this in Sunday school before. We can talk about our faith in a way that is respectful of other people and their viewpoints, but also is faithful to our understanding of who God is in Jesus Christ. Now, you've heard before of the image for the United States of America as a big melting pot. All these different people have come to our shores. We are a nation of immigrants, and the United States is this great melting pot. The problem with the melting pot metaphor is that if you put everything in a pot, all these different and unique ingredients, and you keep them in that pot and you stir them long enough, they lose their particular identity and they end up being some kind of goo that can be served to you by someone wearing a hairnet with an ice cream scooper to put it on your lime green tray and you eat with your plastic fork. Maybe even put it over a piece of toast. It becomes blah and bland. A much better metaphor, I think, for the United States of America is that we are a salad bowl. All the different and unique ingredients mixed together and each being who they are, each adding something to it. So when we talk about our faith, we don't find some gray, mushy common ground. We talk about who we understand Jesus to be. And we do it in a way that is respectful of other folks. You know, I heard an author one time, when he turned 50, talk about the different things that he had learned over the course of his life. Really helpful things like don't lick a steak knife. And one of the other things he learned was people who want to talk to you about your faith, about their faith, rarely ever want to hear about yours. If we're going to talk about our faith, we need to be willing to listen to what other people believe and respect their beliefs. But Presbyterians, I fear, have erred on the side of not talking enough, not talking about who Jesus Christ is and what he means to us. And instead, maybe perhaps we have become the followers of some mushy civic religion that doesn't really stand for anything. Shouldn't we be able to be who we are, say what we believe, and to do it in a way that respects the beliefs of others? I think we have something to add. I know we do. Something worth sharing, the good news. And to that God who came to us in the person and work of Jesus Christ to be good news, be all praise, honor, and glory forever. Amen.